Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is William O. Stevens, author of Marcus Aurelius, Philosopher-King. It's published by Reaction, one of my favorite presses, and it'll be released in December. It's part of a series they have on ancient philosophy. William is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Creighton University. His interests include ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, obviously, Epictetus, Stoicism, and actually current cultural areas like ethics and the environment. And his books include others on Epictetus, Marcus, and Stoicism. We know Marcus through his meditations, if indeed they should be called that. But beyond that discourse, those discourses, if you will, most people are less aware of his life or of his exploits as a commander, a king, and a philosopher, as well as the people and conditions of ancient Rome. So William fleshes out those conditions in a really interesting way. He fleshes out the man, his times, and the empire as he lived and died in the early centuries of Rome after the advent of Christianity and the times of plague. So welcome, William. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Sam. Delighted to be here.
It's funny. It's really nice. I have the life I do because I was talking to my carpenter and my AC guy, and they both were reading meditations. So
really?
Yeah, it's great because all the guys that work with me or for me, they all, his father's reading The Idiot by Dostoevsky. It's just great. It's like these everymen who also are their own philosophers. But
yeah, he's so popular these days. He's just so popular these days, and he appeals to a wide range of people, which is both fitting and odd at the same time.
Have you watched Jerry Seinfeld talking about him?
I have. And Rory McIlroy reads the meditations, and Anna Kendrick likes reading the meditations, and of course, President Bill Clinton was educated by Marcus's views of statecraft and equanimity. So yeah, he's got a very, very broad appeal.
I know one president who doesn't read them. Okay, I said I wasn't going to do that. So because it is your passion, maybe before we get to Marcus, we could set the stage, because we are talking about Stoicism, we could set the stage with Stoicism and one of your favorites, Epictetus, and maybe Seneca to round out the triad.
Sure. So Marcus is the third of the three great late period Stoics. On a lesser tier, I suppose, is Musonius Rufus, the guy who taught Epictetus. But Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius are really the big three in Roman imperial Stoicism under the empire. And Marcus and Epictetus couldn't be more different in terms of their social standing, right? Because Epictetus was born the son of a slave woman. So he was born into slavery. We don't know a lot about his early life, don't know much at all. At some point, he traveled to Rome from Asia Minor and was allowed by his master to study philosophy in Rome with Musonius Rufus and others, still as a slave. And at some point, he was manumitted and set free, and then he moved to Northwest Greece and founded his own school in the little town of Nicopolis and taught philosophy there. But like Socrates, he didn't write, he was just there to teach. So we know about his teachings through one of his students, Arian, who apparently took a great deal of notes in his classroom, and those have survived. So that's how we learned about Epictetus's teachings. And those notes were then circulated as the diatribi, the discourses of Epictetus as written by Arian. And one of Marcus's teachers, right? Marcus groomed for the purple, right? Groomed to rule really from a very early age when he was tapped by Hadrian. He had the finest homeschooling you could have in ancient Rome. So one of his philosophy teachers lent him a copy of Epictetus's discourses. And so that had a very large impact, very big impact on Marcus's own thought and his own evolution, and his eventual allegiance to Stoic philosophy, which was pretty dominant in Rome at the time.
Well, since we're talking about the philosophy side of them, and since you bring it up early in the book, and since the popular, as you know, as you were talking about in terms of the fact that Jerry Seinfeld is reading him every day, you talk about the meditations, and one of the first things you say is, well, that's not really the right title. And a lot of people say that. So since that's what I knew about Marcus before I read your book, talk a little bit about why they either are or are not, or whether they're discourses or whether they're daily thoughts, that kind of thing.
Right. So what we have are a collection of generally short, sometimes just a couple lines, sometimes a few pages. Most of them are just a few paragraphs of kind of journal notes. And there's no indication that Marcus intended anyone else to read these things. He reports on a couple of events or a couple encounters that he had with people that we don't know from other sources. But mostly what they contain are his own reflections of Stoic philosophy meant to help him steady his judgment and deal with the hurly-burly that he faced as emperor every day, conducting wars, dealing with the plague, rebellion of a trusted general, whatever it was, and death. Death is a very common theme that he repeats over and over again. But there's no title. There's no evidence that he gave any title to these writings. So it seems that he didn't, initially at least, intend anyone else to read them. And that separates him from Seneca, right? Seneca very deliberately wrote treatises. He was very self-conscious in his writing style. He wrote dramas, wrote tragedies, and he wrote 124 letters, all of them intended to be published in the ancient literary tradition, right? Not the case with Marcus. So you have a kind of special window into the emperor's thinking, how he managed his emotions, how he held at arm's length the flattery that he was subjected to on a daily basis, right? The applause and that sort of thing. But centuries later, when these things were copied, a later editor decided to call them, his thoughts to himself. And so that was a title for a few editions. And again, not Marcus's title. And so we need a kind of convenient way of referring to Marcus's writings rather than saying his journal or his notes. And many scholars have simply stuck with that convention of referring to them as the Meditations. But since I'm trained in the history of Western philosophy and I read Descartes early on, that title is sort of associated for many philosophers primarily with Descartes' writings. And so the more you kind of poke around in Marcus's notes, the less meditative they really seem in content. And so that's why some editors have come up with alternate titles. Other translators have come up with alternate titles just to refer to the work. And one of them that was suggested by Gregory Hayes in his edition, his more recent translation, is the memoranda. Okay, why the memoranda? Well, because one of the common themes that Marcus repeats over and over again are the things that he needs to remember. He says, bear in mind, remember, don't forget that in many, many, many of these notes. And so memory and how he will be remembered in posterity is really very central to his concern in writing this piece of philosophy.
Yeah, but I thought, and this goes back to Jerry Seinfeld, he's saying, he goes, I die 10 days later, no one's going to remember me. No one's going to know. There's this one guy on, talks about, you die, people go to your wake and they're drinking and talking about golf and mutual funds. And then 2 weeks later, your wife is watching a TV show, comedy, and she laughs, and Marcus is saying, it's just part of everything. It's all gonna happen. Live in the moment. There's no past. There's no future. There's no future because it hasn't happened yet. So why are you saying he's even concerned in any aspect with, and maybe you're not saying it, with his legacy.
Well, because he's reflecting on the obsession with fame that previous emperors have had.
Oh,
So remember that, many of them are deified after their death.
right.
Some of the crazy ones even claim to be gods during their lives. So the deification of emperors was a tradition in Rome for centuries by the time Marcus rose to the throne, right? And so he has to keep his head on straight with his Stoic training and remind himself that he's in fact mortal. He is not a god. He is going to die. And so he has a certain kind of ambivalence because at times he wonders about how he's going to be remembered, but mostly he tells himself, I'm going to be forgotten. Look how all of these guys are eventually going to be forgotten in the centuries to come. And that's, of course, some accurate in some respects, but not in others, because, of course, we still know Marcus today because he was an impactful Roman emperor, right? And so the irony there is we do remember him. And yet he's telling himself fame doesn't matter. How people are going to be forgotten in the centuries to come, if not sooner, as you were saying, right? And so don't think that what you're going to do is going to make you some sort of eternal reputation. That's foolish to think,
Yeah.
right?
It's like,
Instead, the wise thing is to focus on the present.
it's
Focus
like,
on the present, do your duty now, fulfill all of your roles, and be as virtuous as you can every day in every decision and action.
yeah,
That's the only thing that isn't an illusion, an
yeah,
ephemeral illusion.
yeah, he's like the opposite of Ozymandias, tremble when you think of me and no one's thinking of him. Um,
Exactly.
but
Exactly. And death, of course, is part of life. Death is how nature recycles itself endlessly. So there's nothing new from generation to generation. Birth, aging, death, it's the same cycle. And it's not bad, it's good because it's natural and it's providential, according to Marcus.
we should back up a little. And of course, I want to go to Marcus's life and Rome at the time and Christianity and the plague and all that. But I guess we should back up a little because most people, most persons, and you read a book about the concept of persons, most people today, it's like, and we were talking about sports. So take Jalen Hurts, the quarterback of the Eagles. He doesn't smile. He doesn't laugh. He doesn't celebrate. Even when we block the field goal and run back for a touchdown, Jordan does. He just sits there. Everyone else is jumping all over the place. He's just sitting there, not a smile on his face. That's what people look at today as stoicism. But that's not all stoicism. That is just not hiding your emotions and just, well, not hiding them, but be emotionless and not worry about things.
Exactly. So that's a common distortion, right? Self-control is a virtue for the Stoics. It is a virtue. So there is a degree of equanimity that the Stoics strive for, but it isn't a matter of hiding negative emotions, whether it's a pleasant feeling, a positive emotion, or a negative one. For the Stoics, the goal is to eliminate all negative emotions, anger first and foremost, but also fear and greed and lust. These are the turbulent negative emotions that are unpleasant to experience, and they thwart your attempt to achieve good ends. They force you to make bad decisions. They lead to bad judgments, and they're also the result of false beliefs and false judgments. So for Marcus, the goal is to live in agreement with nature. And what that means for human beings, the Stoics thought, was living in agreement with our particular strength as humans, which is reason, logos in the Greek, right? So to live in agreement with nature for humans means living in agreement with reason. And to perfect our reason as adults takes an entire lifetime. And the perfection of reason is what they called arete, or virtue. So
Yeah.
that means living in agreement with perfected reason is living in agreement with virtue. And that means wisdom, courage, self-control, or temperance, or moderation, depending on how you want to translate it, and piety. So the goal is to focus on what's up to you and make the right decisions in every circumstance so that you fulfill your roles, you contribute to the common good, and you're a good parent if you have children. You're a good son or daughter, right? You're a good sibling if you have siblings, and you're a good citizen, a good neighbor. And in Marcus's case, he's striving to be a good emperor because that's what fate has dealt him when it comes to his cards, right? How he plays those cards are up to him. The cards that he's dealt, that's up to fate. That's up to nature, the universe's cosmic reason, which you're supposed to align yourself with, right? So every event which a non-Stoic views as a catastrophe or a disaster, or at least something bad, a Stoic reconceives as a challenge, an opportunity to exercise your virtue, use your reason to persevere and pursue your virtuous goals.
Yeah, I like the way that because I still think of it this way, you have the skin, you have these bones, you have these veins, you have these arteries, it doesn't really mean anything at all. And the other thing is that you mentioned equanimity a couple of times. Have you heard this new thing called the gray rock method?
No,
The idea,
no.
like when Jerry says you're dealing with jerks and idiots all day long, or narcissists, and the idea is the worst thing for a narcissist is if when he goes on his rant, you just don't say a thing. Or every once in a while you go, okay. And then
Don't respond.
yeah, and eventually he
Right,
hangs up on you, and that's it,
right.
because there's no satisfaction for him. So
That's right.
yeah, because
That's right.
I've been reading a lot about equanimity, and I was thinking as I was reading the book after how much, and it's much more of a Buddhist concept, but how similar the two things are,
Yeah, the idea is you're in charge of your own affects. You're in charge of your own emotional responses, and your emotional responses are the result of judgments that you make. So if you're in the company of a blowhard, if you're in the company of a narcissist or a braggart, right? Or someone who's just plain obnoxious or telling off-color jokes in mixed company or something like that, someone who's just rude, right? Or a flatterer, whoever it is. You recognize first, this person is doing what they're doing on the belief that it's right for them to be doing it at the time. And their belief that it's appropriate for them to behave that way is not a belief that you have to share. You can recognize that they're misbehaving by your standards of conduct, but it might not be your responsibility to try to correct their behavior, right? You might have an opportunity to point out to them that what they're saying is incorrect or overblown or rude and discourteous. But most of all, you want to keep your head on straight. And so don't let them push your buttons, right? Don't let them force a response out of you. You don't have to lose your cool because somebody else has lost his, right?
well,
And so that's how you maintain Stoic calm or equanimity, right? And that aspect of the contemporary understanding of being a Stoic with a small s, there's truth to that, right? But the Stoics are seeking wisdom. It's not just a matter of staying calm no matter what. It's a matter of making the right judgments to fulfill all of your roles, some of which you've chosen, some of which have been assigned to you by nature or fate. And as I said, that means being a good neighbor, a good sibling, a good fellow traveler, a good sport if you're engaged in sports, right?
yeah.
You have respect for your opponents. If they perform better than you, then they deserve to win, and you should applaud the excellence of the virtuosic performance, right? The outcome, that's not up to you or your opponent. That's up to all sorts of circumstantial factors beyond everybody's control. So you should focus on playing well yourself, right? And take the rest as it happens.
Well, that reminds me of a question you've probably gotten a lot in your work is, was Marcus a philosopher who just happened to be a king, or a king who dabbled in philosophy? So I'm thinking of what you're saying, but here's a commander that's going off and fighting war after war, conquering other people that may be his equal or may be weaker than him, very few times superior. But that seems like it is at odds with the equanimity idea, that the concept of conquering, but that's Rome.
Yeah. That's a very good question, Sam. Yeah. So here's what I would say. Marcus was trained and educated from an early age in all the liberal arts, right? In rhetoric, in speech, in painting. He enjoyed painting. In music, he liked to dance. He was inducted to this order of the Salian priests, and they would do these archaic dances, and they had these special outfits that they wore as part of his expression of piety and affirmation of orthopraxy, right? Practice and ritual respect for the gods and reverence for the gods. He was into all of that. And he was very much a natural philosopher because that's what he was most drawn to. So from childhood on, he was trained in philosophy and enjoyed philosophy. And he recognized that he was being groomed to rule. But that happened much later. So, in answer to your question, I would pose it this way. I would say Marcus was a natural born philosopher. And later he had that role of being emperor thrust upon him. And in fact, he took a page out of Plato's Republic, where Plato writes that philosopher kings don't want to be kings and queens. They would rather philosophize and contemplate and pursue wisdom because they recognize that doing politics is often a grubby kind of business, right? Whereas communing with the forms and the true and the beautiful and the good, that's what is the highest form of life for any intellectual, any philosopher, any human being, in fact, according to Plato. And so philosopher kings are reluctant to be kings. They do it out of service to the common good, not because they want the power, right? And that seems to be the case with Marcus. When Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father, died, the Senate wanted Marcus to be emperor. They asked him to serve, and he had been designated as the heir, but he did not immediately agree to do it. Instead, he said, no, I want my adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, to be a co-emperor with me. And that is my condition upon which I will agree to be a co-emperor and rule Rome. And that was unprecedented. No previous emperor had ever shared power with an equal. It was a one-person job, a one-man job. So this was very different for Marcus to insist on being a co-emperor, sharing the responsibilities of rule. And as far as being a military commander, he had no experience with that, growing up and learning how to rule with Antoninus Pius, because Pius had the good fortune of not having any major conflicts during his emperorship. He didn't fight any wars. It was a very peaceful time for Antoninus Pius. But as a consequence of that, he couldn't teach Marcus how to be a commander of generals, how to be a commander in chief. He had no experience doing it. And so he had nothing to teach Marcus when it came to that discipline of expertise. And so when conflicts did erupt, when Marcus and Lucius Verus became co-emperors, they had no experience doing it. So they had to rely very heavily on the generals who did have experience in warfare.
It's interesting that because since I'm a bookseller, first thing I think of is sometimes an epigraph, but mostly the cover, because everyone who comes into my bookstore judges the book by its cover.
Of course.
And it's a great cover. And then the first thing I noticed was just what we were talking about. Most books about Marcus say Marcus Aurelius, but it says philosopher-king. And I thought, well, he put it in that order, so the book is going to be a book, as I thought of Marcus as a philosopher first, and a king because he had to be.
And that's the way it's packaged by Plato in the Republic. So that's why I deliberately chose that title, because Marcus, this is not an original idea of mine. Marcus has been thought of as a philosopher king for centuries and centuries. But what I decided to do was to really lean into that concept so that I could explore the sense in which he was like and dislike Plato's notion of a philosopher king, right? Marcus was a different sort of Roman animal, and the empire was huge, of course, throughout Marcus's entire lifetime. So this is an empire of millions of people. How does one person govern that thing? Well, the answer is you got a lot of subordinates, and you have to deal with them. and communication is slow, and medicine is very primitive. And so the challenges were enormous.
Well, that's the thing is, okay, he's a philosopher, he's a Stoic, but he's doing this among struggling with dealing with a pandemic. He's struggling with betrayal. At one time, a
Yes.
trusted general. He's dealing with uh, social upheaval. He's dealing with Christianity. And if you go to his discourses, meditations, he should be approaching.
Memoranda,
Yeah,
as I
memorandum.
like to call it. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I'll call it then from now on, rest of my life. Yeah, so he's dealing with all these things. So you look at the memoranda and you look at Stoicism and what he's saying in those. That's really hard to apply to a day-to-day struggle with running, like you say, millions of people amidst an empire that's struggling. And that's what I was saying about your side steps is when you talk about, it was one of my favorite parts of the book, when you talk about the filth of Rome,
Yes.
which I want to talk about because that's great.
Okay.
Yeah, he's struggling against all of that at the same time he's sitting there, although I guess he wrote them during his campaigns most of all, but he's still sitting there writing these things that to me seem totally contradictory.
Right. Right. So first of all, he's surrounded by non-Stoics. Once he's an emperor and he's an adult, he's not spending time, in lectures learning from Stoic teachers anymore. He might be exchanging some letters with them from time to time, but he's got the full-time job of ruling, of governing. And he does have Lucius Verus's help, but Lucius Verus is not only not a Stoic, he's not any kind of a philosopher. He was more of a playboy. He was more of a libertine. He liked to be entertained. And he took credit for military victories that he didn't even observe firsthand. He was miles behind the lines. And so he took credit uh, for his generals' achievements on that front in the Parthian War, for example. So Marcus is surrounded by non-Stoics, non-philosophers, people that are looking out for themselves, for their own good, and they're flattering him and they're trying to get what they want. And so the longer Marcus is ruling, the farther from his mind, I imagine, his Stoic principles become, right? They recede from his thought because he's got to deal with ruling the empire and all those administrative issues and conflicts and the pandemic every day. And so, how is he going to navigate that? Well, he returns to his Stoic education. That's why he has to remind himself in the memoranda, things to be remembered. He has to remind himself about Stoic physics, logic, and ethics. And he has to remind himself about the Stoic perspective on death, on fame, on change, on loving your fellow human beings, on the body, as you said earlier, being a tangled web of bones and nerves and blood, right? That's utterly disgusting on the inside. And of course, he observes corpses on the battlefield. So he's seen severed hands and severed legs and beheaded bodies. And with the soul gone and intellect gone, it's just rotting garbage. So you have this very negative theme toward the body in the memoranda. But he's reminding himself that he's mortal and that things that non-Stoics pursue as wonderful goods, like pleasure, fancy clothes, delicious wine, sumptuous feasts, sexual ecstasy, all of these things are fleeting and trivial. What matters is virtue. What matters is obeying the gods and doing his part to be as virtuous as he can in every moment, in every decision, in every action. Everything else is garbage compared to virtue. So that's what he's reminding himself of, those Stoic lessons in writing the memoranda.
Well, since in your talks and some of the really good YouTube videos you do, you bring all this stuff to current times, like Stoicism during holiday trips or talking about Gladiator. The thing I was thinking of is like he's like Ned Stark at the beginning of Game of Thrones. You see Ned Stark, he's this wonderful person, has wonderful qualities. So you assume he's going to be the hero of the series. And just like J.R.R. Martin or Martin does, is he cuts the legs off out from under you. Ned Stark is this great guy, but the problem is he's so virtuous that everybody else is going to take advantage of him easily and set him up for total disaster. And it seems like almost like Marcus would have been in that position. He was betrayed, but he successfully avoided, being deposed.
That's right. And that, but bear in mind, that could have played out very differently. In fact, Marcus never had to face Avidius Cassius, the usurper,
Right.
on the battlefield. It didn't get to that point. Avidius Cassius was murdered by one of his own men, right? So whether Marcus's wife Faustina urged Avidius Cassius to attempt the coup or not, and there's some evidence that she might have in writing to him because she was afraid that Marcus was going to die and Commodus wasn't old enough to take the throne. So a sympathetic reading is she was worried about her own security and her own welfare and that of her son Commodus. That might have been the case, but it seems that Avidius Cassius made the decision to do it because he heard this rumor that Marcus had died. And so since he recognized that he had the experience and his troops urged him to do it, he didn't want to have some sort of strange civil war, some sort of bloody civil war with Marcus's generals who sided with Commodus, because Commodus wasn't old enough yet. So he decided, okay, I'm going to declare myself emperor. And of course, there was a tradition of doing exactly this in the Principate, right? Sometimes when a general was very, very successful, his troops would say, they would elevate him and say, you should be emperor. We support you. We'll fight for you. You should be emperor, right? So he was hardly the first Roman general to allow his troops to egg him on to declare himself general and try to seize power. But it didn't last very long. One of his troops eventually betrayed him and killed him before Marcus could even muster the troops and travel east to put down the rebellion. So, a non-Stoic would say Marcus was lucky. A Stoic would say that's how providence works.
Yeah, life kind of happens to you. It's like the movie Sliding Doors. It could go either way. Just a moment that it ends up being an inflection point.
That's a great movie, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, to continue the metaphor of Game of Thrones, it's like Commodus is almost like King Joffrey to me. Yeah.
Oh man, talk about and where did his love of gladiation come from? He loved the gladiatorial bouts. So of course, some ancient authors, since they hated Commodus and he had a terrible reputation, they spun this story that he was actually the illegitimate son of a gladiator that had an affair with Marcus's wife, Faustina. And since Marcus was sanctified, he was treated as a saint for several centuries after his death in the Christian literature, which is ironic, right? In a way. They wanted to kind of cleanse Marcus's image and excuse him or free him from blame for anointing Commodus as his successor and heir. And one way to do that is that, well, Commodus was never really his son. He was illegitimate. His father was a gladiator that had an affair with Faustina. We do not know that that's the case. The evidence does not indicate that clearly at all. But maybe he was like his adoptive uncle Lucius Verus, and he liked the games and he liked, the circus and that sort of thing. But in any case, yeah, Commodus really had a taste for the bloodlust. He liked the blood sport. He did atrocious stuff. So why did Marcus let him become emperor? Well, the short answer is, there had not been a hereditary succession in generations. So Commodus was Marcus's blood son, right? This is his bloodline. And so this was the natural thing to do. He was the natural born heir to Marcus. And so Marcus hoped that through education and training, Commodus would become a good emperor. And he turned out to be wrong posthumously.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the great things about your book is you end up starting to think, like it's a soap opera. Why doesn't he see through him? Why can't he figure out that this is the wrong guy? Why can't he why can't he see that this guy is not going to work out? That's the worst possible guy. And then so you think, okay, you take yourself back there and why couldn't I just tell him, no, I need to give you advice. Don't get married to that woman. It's not going to work out. as I've said to many of my friends, they come to me and they say, "Do you think I should get married?" No, I don't think you should get married to her.
And what other options did he have, right? I mean,
Yeah,
so
right.
having discussed Avidius Cassius, so here's his most trusted, most powerful general, Avidius Cassius, who tries to take over the throne, who declares himself the new emperor and is a usurper, right? So his most trusted general betrayed him. So if he's not going to go with his own flesh and blood son, who's he going to pick? There was really nobody else. There was
Yeah.
really nobody else. He did not have Russell Crowe in the wings. He did not have Maximus Decimus Meridius. That's a fictional character, right? He did not have a devoted general who was like his son. He had his actual son. It was really the only choice he could make.
Yeah, I guess. The
And
funny thing,
he didn't recognize, I mean, one criticism I suppose you could make about Marcus is that he didn't see, perhaps he didn't see in other men that they just didn't take their duties nearly as seriously as he himself did. So with Lucius Verus, he didn't have a natural knack for being a good monarch. Marcus recognized that he was a playboy and a libertine and didn't really, take very seriously his duties to Rome, to the empire. And yet, Marcus wanted him to, and he urged him to, and he tried to put him in a position to be a decent co-emperor. So was Marcus being foolish, or was he doing the best he could to try to fulfill his duty as an adoptive brother, right? To get his brother to toe the line, right? I
yeah,
mean, that's the more sympathetic reading, right? And similarly, he's doing the same with Commodus. He surely recognized Commodus's weaknesses. He recognized his vices, but he also recognized that he was young. And so he did the best he could as a father to improve his son.
yeah, I shouldn't be too harsh. Not that I have a right to be harsh, but it's like my dad used to do. He used to say, "Do as I say, not as I do," and then
Right.
he always said, "Never take a partner." And then he took four partners, and they all screwed him over. But he was very careful to say, don't do what I do. Do as I say. And that reminds me a lot of Marcus. I mythologize my father, and my brother says, "You mythologize dad." And I go, "Well, if you're going to mythologize someone, it may as well be your dad."
Well, and you can find role models wherever you see virtues. The
Exactly.
Stoics believe in the unity of the virtues, but many philosophers think no, it's possible to have a few virtues and then other vices, right? This is the much easier view.
Yeah. More
The
pleasant.
Stoic view means that none of us are virtuous. None of us have any of the virtues unless someone has all of the virtues. Those people are as rare as the phoenix, the Stoics would say.
Yeah, they're saints.
That's right. That's right. And Marcus was not a saint. That's what and the sanctification of Marcus, I think, does him discredit in a funny sort of way because he was a real human being. He had strengths and weaknesses. He had virtues and he had shortcomings. And I think that for a clear-eyed historian, it's really important to present Marcus with his warts, right? With his wrinkles, with his the bad judgments that he did make. So overall, he was not a monster, but he was a fascinating guy who did emulate some real virtues and achieved some pretty remarkable things in the face of incredibly difficult predicaments.
Yeah, and it's funny. That's why, again, another reason why the book is so valuable is that most people, having read just, I was going to say meditations, memoranda, um, it's not that it's two-dimensional, but you're reading it as this wonderful series of discourses, statements, dear Abby, advice that recognizes this person as a sage and who has this legacy, like Jerry said, and you said, he didn't want to have a legacy. It's ironic that he actually does have this legacy. But what your book does is flesh out the fact, yeah, that he has weaknesses.
And that's one of the real powers of the memoranda, as I see it, is the earnestness. He's not posturing for anyone. These are sentences that he's writing for himself
George
to
Washington.
remember what he's doing, what his role is, how to commit himself to working with others, forgiving them, loving them for who they are, and trying to promote the common good. He's not trying to impress anybody. He's not worried about his PR. These are notes that he's written for himself. This is his field manual for keeping his head on straight.
Yeah, it's like George
And
Washington's rules of civility.
exactly. And so it's remarkable that we benefit so much from looking over Marcus's shoulder and reading his private notes, because he wrote them not for us. They are not written for us. He wrote them for his own use. And yet, because of the sincerity and the earnestness and the seriousness of this guy, they're very beneficial for our own problems, and we can apply them to our own lives.
Well, and yeah, and you write about popular culture and ethics. And so why do you think, as we were talking about earlier, Anna Kendrick, Jerry Seinfeld, sports stars, why is it that somehow did they all just of a moment pick up Marcus and begin to read this? Or how did it become this meme?
It's because of the popularity growth, right? So, I mean, decades ago, Marcus would only be read by academics, right? Philosophers and classicists would
Yeah.
teach Marcus a little bit to their undergraduates. But Stoicism itself has become so popular as a practice over the last several decades. And Marcus is, in a way, much easier to read than Seneca, right? I mean, I think Epictetus is wonderful to read as well. But all of these three Roman authors, and to a much lesser extent, Musonius Rufus, they've taken on this reputation in the popular imagination as providing real wisdom for everyday life. They are problem solvers when it comes to psychological confusion, when it comes to frustration and disappointment. How do you build resilience? How do you cope with unexpected events, difficult coworkers, difficult parents or children, right? And the Stoics have therapies for addressing your anger, controlling your anger, thinking about it correctly, right? Not avoiding envy and jealousy, right?
Yeah.
So that practicality is there, but it's philosophically challenging, and it helps to know the philosophical system in which those ethical maxims play a role, because the Stoic philosophy is much more than a set of maxims.
Yeah, it's like I was saying earlier, when I prepare for interviews, I just talk to other people because they always give me a question, because it's just me. So I'd rather ask somebody. Well, and it's so funny because all of them, yeah, like at least 6 friends. And like I said, my carpenter, my handyman, the HVAC guy today. It's great, isn't
That's
it?
wonderful, and it's really wonderful. I mean, I welcome that. I mean, I applaud that, right?
They all
Because
say, they all say, I read him almost daily. That's the key. It's not like you read a novel or read a treatise. The reason why you can read them almost daily is the reason why it's so digestible, because it's one idea, it's one thought, it's one lesson. You can, and then you can ponder that one lesson that you've read, whether it's about mortality or regret or living in the moment or the future or the past. You can think about just that all day long.
that's right, and because of the digestibility, it seems like that's probably how Marcus wrote it too.
Yeah.
He only had time to jot down a couple entries or one long one each night when he's in his tent, because the next morning he's got to get up and see what the latest is with the barbarians along the Danube and what trouble they've made, right?
So talk about because I wanted to get to it, talk about daily life, not only for him and what he had to do, but talk about just talk about the filth of Rome. For one, that's exactly what I want.
Yeah, so right. So it's really startling because we think of the Romans as great engineers, and they were absolutely that. And they did build sewers in Rome. And so we moderns think, oh, well, okay, so they know how to manage human waste. Well, the problem was, for them, the sewers were to deal with stormwater runoff, because Rome was built originally in this low-lying kind of swampy area, right, on the Tiber, and the Tiber would flood. So if you're going to have a city there so that you can import the grain up the Tiber, right, from Ostia and unload it, that's a great place for getting food and materials into the city from the sea. But since the Tiber flooded so often, you had to deal with the floodwaters. So that's why they had these trenches, which they upgraded into sewers. They didn't have toilets. They didn't have the standards of hygiene that we do. And so they had disease all the time. People would urinate and defecate, sometimes out in the street, right? They would throw their refuse from meals and dead animals out into the street. And so walking the streets of Rome would involve dodging piles of human and animal feces, urine, right? Rotting bits of food and bone, corpses. They would have broken pottery that would accumulate in this one pit. They're just huge amounts of human waste. So they didn't have the science of waste management, anything like we moderns did. And so what's remarkable is not that they faced disease, but that the diseases that they faced didn't kill all of them off.
Yeah. Which goes to the plague. And then I'm reading about his death and I'm thinking, well, seems like he could have easily died of the plague.
And that's a possibility that the plague eventually took him in the end. We don't know for sure. He had kind of fragile health throughout his life. And he was taking this medicine called theriac from really the best physician of the day, Galen, right? Who was a philosopher as well. His physician was actually a real philosopher, and we have huge tomes, many pages written by Galen survive, which is good for students of ancient philosophy.
And his medical advice extended to the late Middle Ages.
Yes. He had huge pioneering insights into anatomy because he would dissect corpses and learn how the different organs and muscles and bones and joints were connected. But when it came to pharmacology, they had this stuff theriac. So apparently theriac was this concoction that had dozens of different ingredients, including viper flesh and opium and all sorts of other weird stuff. And previous emperors would take doses of this theriac regularly as a kind of antidote to poison. And to help Marcus sleep, because of the opium, he prescribed the theriac to Marcus, which he would take. But then he would find that he was too groggy during the day, and then he would stop taking it. And so getting the right amount was very difficult for Marcus, dealing with his respiratory issue that he might have had. And then ultimately, yeah, it could have been the plague that killed him.
What about the guys who say that he could have been euthanized by some kind and gentle doctor?
Yeah, we don't know that, right? That's a possibility too, that Marcus had some kind of disease, whether it was the plague or something else, and he was in great suffering, and he was almost just short of 59. So he had lived a decent length of life at that point by ancient standards. And it could be that he recognized that he was in the process of dying, or that's how they diagnosed him anyway. And it's possible they euthanized him, right? That's a possibility as well. We do know that there's no evidence that he was smothered by the embrace of Commodus, despite what the wonderful movie Gladiator suggests.
Well, that is the other thing. I mean, you've been doing this almost all of your adult life, and I always wonder, I mean, you really don't have the original writings. You have things that were written down in the Middle Ages by scribes who were interpreting not documents, but tablets and papyrus that no longer existed. I always wonder about that.
Yeah. So exactly. So you have the transmission of these reports, one written in the Historia Augusta. You've got these biographies that are written long after the people described in them have died. So there must have been some sort of oral tradition combined with notes that maybe those who were alive in Marcus's time wrote down that do not survive. But instead, this is what we have. So it's second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth hand, and the reliability of these sources is not what we would hope it would be. But we also have other kinds of evidence. We do have archaeological evidence for the military activities that took place in Central Europe, right, where the forts were, that sort of thing, and statuary. So you have the marbles and the busts, and these can be dated, and we also have the coins, right, the numismatology, right, the study of the ancient coins and different hoards that are discovered, and they commemorate events historically. So they help us date things, and we can make inferences about those things as well.
I wonder what Marcus would have thought about like today, where I was in Europe one time and we were with some Swedish couple and they asked what percentage of Americans take like antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. And I said, I don't know, maybe 40%. And they were appalled. And I wonder what he would think of the idea of like not dulling your senses, but preventing depression using pharmaceuticals, since you mentioned medicine.
Yeah, well, in the case of the Theriac, it wouldn't have been an antidepressant. I mean, that concept, there wouldn't be anything like that in ancient Rome. So yeah, for Marcus, keeping his senses sharp would be vital, as it would be for anyone who's in a position of privilege, as he was, and didn't have to worry about scrounging for food.
So like in conclusion, I guess, because we could go on for a long time, and because what we were talking about in popular culture, and because you write about ethics in popular culture as well, recognizing that a lot of people are aware of him now and a lot of people read the memoranda, what would you want? I know what I took away from this book. Let me ask you, what would you want the readers, because it is very accessible, what would you want them to take away from this? And when I sell this book, what should I say that the reason why this is going to be a really good read for them?
Well, just straightforwardly, I mean, I suppose two main things. One is the history of ancient Rome is fascinating. And so, if one thing that a reader takes away from the book is the desire to learn more about ancient Rome, that would make me very happy. I would consider myself to be successful as an author of this biography. There's so much to learn. I learned a great deal about Roman history and Roman religion, Roman politics, environmental change in antiquity. Fascinating stuff. So I would hope that people would continue to pursue their interest in Roman history more generally. And then the other thing is, of course, as a philosopher, I would hope that they would want to read other ancient philosophers, read Epictetus, fascinating philosophical thoughts in the discourses, read Seneca, read about his biography and his other philosophical works. Uh, Most people will have not have heard of Musonius Rufus. He's well worth reading as well. And so reading ancient Stoic texts, learning about ancient Epicureanism and ancient skepticism in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Platonism, all of that I find fascinating as a philosopher. I would hope others would read beyond Marcus's Stoicism and read other Stoics and other philosophers as well. If they do that, then I think my book is contributed.
Well, I definitely have, and for good or for bad, ChatGPT has helped me immensely in learning about it. But thank you so much for being here today, and I look forward, after you write your next book, to speaking to you again if we can.
Oh, thanks very much, Sam. Enjoyed it very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Kind of hope you make it to the World Series, but actually I don't.
Well, back in June, I was hoping for a Cubs-Tigers World Series, but I'm much less hopeful now.
You got to
We'll
get
see what happens.
past the Dodgers and the Brewers. Okay.
But often the best team doesn't always win, right? The best team during the regular season often doesn't win. That's why your Phillies are so good, because they turn it up when it matters the most, right?
Well, not in the past 2 years, and I was at the game 6 and 7. I'll delete this from this. All right, we'll stop it where we stopped it.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Thanks, Sam.
All right, I'll give you a call after one of the games. Maybe we can go to a game together.
Yeah, that would be great. That'd be good. We actually drove down to Pennsylvania last week and we saw the Pirates host the Cubs for 2 games. That was wonderful.
If the Cubs make it, we have the home field advantage, so I'll give you a call.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Wonderful interview, Sam. You're really, really good at this. This is terrific.
Thanks so much. It's easy when the book is good and you've read it, which a lot of interviewers don't. I give myself credit for that. it's much easier, and it's much easier when it's as accessible as it is, not only in writing but talking to you too. So
I'm glad you found it to be so. I really wanted to write for a broad audience, so I'm glad you found it to be easy enough to read. That's
Oh
good.
yeah, I can tell. Yeah.
Terrific.
Okay.
Thanks, Sam.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Yeah.